Imagine you are standing in a room that smells of damp stone and something else. Something cloyingly sweet, like wilted flowers. The air is cold, so cold it feels like a presence, a weight against your skin. You are holding a linen cloth, dipped in cool water, to the forehead of a woman whose name you learned only yesterday. Her name is Eleanor. Her breath is a fragile thread in the silence. The only other sound is the slow, methodical tick of a grandfather clock in the hall, counting down moments that no longer feel like they belong to her. You are 17. You believe you are here to help, to offer comfort. But a knot of ice has been forming in your stomach for weeks, a feeling you have no name for. The door cracks open. Matron Hawthorne enters, a shadow in a black dress. She doesn't look at Eleanor. She looks at you. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, seen to see, straight through your thin wool shawl, to the shivering doubt in your soul. She places a hand on your shoulder. It is not a gesture of comfort. It is a gesture of possession. Her suffering is great, the matron whispers, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She holds a small, dark bottle. It is time for God's peace. You watch as she tips the bottle to Eleanor's lips. The woman does not resist. She is too tired. Her breathing, already so shallow, simply stops. It does not sputter. It does not gasp. It just ceases. An exhale that never finds its inhale. The silence that follows is absolute. The matron smooths the blanket over Eleanor's still form, her movements calm, practiced. She turns back. To you, her expression one of solemn piety. It is a mercy, she says. And you are left standing there, the cold cloth still in your hand, her words echoing in a room that has suddenly become a tomb. If the silence in that room makes your own breath catch in your throat, subscribe to our channel. Some stories are not history lessons. They are warnings. And they must be told, no matter how quiet the scream. Our story begins not with a monster, but with a saint. In the year 1823, on the salt-sprayed coast of New England, the town of Port Blossom praised the name of Matron Althea Hawthorne. Her institution, perched on a windswept cliff overlooking the gray Atlantic, was called the Haven of Perpetual Solace. To the town council, to the pastor at the First Congregational Church, to the wealthy merchants who donated to its upkeep, the Haven was a monument to Christian charity. It was a home for the homeless, a hospice for the dying, a place where the forgotten refuse of society could find a clean bed and a peaceful end. Here, the elderly widow with no family, the consumptive sailor coughed up by the sea, the unwed mother shamed into the shadows, they were all welcomed. Matron Hawthorne, a widow herself, was seen as their shepherd, guiding her flock through their final valley of shadow. She was austere, yes. Her smile was as rare as a winter rose. But her work, her good works, were undeniable. She took in the burdens no one else would carry, and one of those burdens was a girl named Elara, an orphan, born of the docks, with eyes the same color as the restless sea. Elara had been destined for the poorhouse, a fate considered by many to be worse than a slow death. But the matron had seen something in her, a quiet strength, a capacity for work, and had taken her in as an apprentice. At 17, Elara knew only gratitude. She was learning to be useful. She swept the stone floors until they shone. She laundered linen stained with sickness and despair. And she learned to sit with the dying, to offer a hand to hold, a sip of water, a quiet prayer. She was taught that death in this house was not an enemy. It was a release, a blessed deliverance from a world of pain. She believed it because she had to, because the alternative was the cold, unforgiving street, because the matron was her savior, and the haven was her home. It was only later, much later, that she would understand that some saviors demand a price far too high, and that some homes are not shelters, but traps. The world of 1823 was a world of sharp edges and whispered fears. Life was a fragile flame, easily snuffed out by cholera, by influenza, by the wasting sickness they called consumption. In towns like Port Blossom, death was a constant, familiar neighbor. It was in the tolling of the church bell, in the shuttered windows of a grieving home, in the small hand-carved headstones that dotted the churchyard like crooked teeth. And because death was everywhere, the business of death was a necessity. But the haven of perpetual solace was different. It wasn't a family affair, passed down through generations. It was a mission. Matron Hawthorne had founded it with her late husband's inheritance, transforming the old cliffside manor into a beacon of compassion. Or so the story went. The system she built was flawless in its outward appearance. The town provided funds. The church provided blessings. And the matron provided results. She eased the burden on the community. She gave the dying a dignity they couldn't afford in life. It was a perfect symbiotic relationship. Inside the walls, however, a different system was at play. A system of quiet observation and chilling efficiency. Elara, in her first few months, learned the rhythms of the house. The morning was for chores. The afternoon was for care. But the night belonged to the matron. It was then that she would make her rounds, her footfalls silent in the yawn. Long, dark corridors. It was then that the air would grow thick with the scent of strange herbs steeping, of chemicals that burned the back of the throat smells. The matron explained away as medicinal vapors to cleanse the air of sickness. Elara learned not to ask questions. She learned that the patients who were the most troubled, the most delirious, the most resistant to their fate, were often the ones who found their peace the most suddenly. A quiet corner of her mind began to keep a tally, a silent record of the faces that were there at dusk and gone by dawn. Doubt is not a thunderclap. It is a slow seeping of water into stone. For Elara, it began with the smell of the tonics. The matron called them comforting draughts, a blend of poppy syrup, chamomile, and other soothing herbs to ease pain and bring on sleep. She prepared them herself in a small locked room off the main infirmary. But Elara, tasked with washing the vials and cups, noticed a residue that chamomile did not leave, a faint metallic bitterness that clung to the glass. She noticed the way the matron's gaze would linger on a patient, not with compassion, but with a kind of assessment, like a farmer judging livestock. She was measuring their worth, their cost, their remaining time not in days, but in doses. Then there were the sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The dying are rarely silent. There is a struggle, a rattling breath, a final fight for life. But at the haven, the end often came with an unnatural quiet, a placid slipping away that felt less like a departure and more like an erasure. Elara began to watch the others. There were two other apprentice girls, Mary and Anya, both as young and lost as she was. Mary was timid, her eyes always downcast, too frightened to see what was right in front of her. But Anya was different. She had a spark of defiance, a cynicism born of a harder life. One evening, as they were folding clean sheets that still smelled faintly of lye, Anya leaned in close. "Have you noticed," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crashing of the waves outside, "that no one ever seems to get better here? They only get quieter." The question hung between them, dangerous and undeniable. It was the first time the fear had been given a voice. And in that moment, Elara knew she was not alone in her dread. The stone of her certainty had its first crack. Anya had come from a fishing family, her father and brothers lost to a squall the previous year. She had none of Elara's naive gratitude for the haven. She saw it for what it was, a last resort. Her eyes missed nothing. She saw the way the matron's ledger of donations didn't seem to account for the expensive chemicals delivered in unmarked crates from Boston. She noticed that the bodies prepared for burial were often lighter than they should have been, as if something had been removed. They would talk in hushed tones in the laundry room, the steam from the washing tubs providing a cloak of secrecy. "She watches them," Anya said one night, her knuckles white as she wrung out a heavy sheet. "She watches them sleep." I saw her, not like a nurse, like a wolf. Elara felt a thrill of terror and validation. She had seen it too. She had once woken in the dead of night, needing a drink of water, and had seen the matron's silhouette in the doorway of the men's ward. She wasn't tending to anyone. She was just standing there, a specter in the moonlight, observing. The two girls formed a fragile alliance, a silent pact to watch the watcher. They started paying closer attention to the comforting drafts. They noted which patients received the darkest, most bitter-smelling doses. Inevitably, those were the ones who would be gone by morning, their passing marked only by an empty bed and the matron's solemn entry in her logbook, "Released unto the Lord." It was a system of cruelty disguised as a sacrament, and they were its unwilling acolytes. Their shared knowledge was a heavy burden, but it was also a shield. As long as they had each other, the suffocating silence of the haven felt a little less absolute. They didn't know what they could do. How could two penniless orphans challenge a woman revered as a living saint? But they could watch, and they could remember the names. Every system of control, no matter how absolute, will eventually be tested by an element it cannot predict. For the haven, that element arrived in the form of a young sailor named Finn. He wasn't old or chronically ill. He had been pulled from the wreckage of a ship that had foundered on the rocks below the cliff, his legs shattered, but his spirit defiantly intact. He was loud, he was angry, and he had no intention of dying. He was a shock of vibrant, unruly life in the quiet, orderly halls of the dying. For Elara, he was more than a patient. He was a memory of the world outside, of the tangy smell of the docks, of the raucous laughter of men who wrestled with the sea and won. His presence was a breath of fresh, salty air in the stale, medicated atmosphere of the haven. He refused to be placid. He cursed the matron's bland broth and demanded rum. He told stories of faraway ports, of storms that could swallow a ship whole, of the sheer, stubborn joy of being alive. Elara found herself making excuses to be in his ward, just to listen to the sound of his voice. She saw the way Anya's eyes would light up when he teased her. Finn was a promise that this place was not the end of the world, but merely a stop along the way. A promise that one could be broken and still heal. He was hope, embodied, in a stubborn, blue-eyed sailor who refused to be comforted. And that, Elara would soon learn, was the most dangerous thing a person could be in the haven of perpetual solace. Matron Hawthorne did not tolerate hope. It was an impurity in her well-ordered world. It was a variable she needed to control, the matron's attention fixed on Finn. At first, she tried her usual methods of quiet authority, of pious condescension. "The Lord tests us with suffering to purify our souls," she would tell him, her voice smooth as polished stone. Finn would just laugh, a raw, grating sound that echoed in the hallowed quiet. "The Lord can test someone else," he'd retort. "I've got healing to do." He refused her nightly tonics, batting the cup away. "I need my wits about me," he insisted, his eyes sharp and suspicious. For a week, there was a standoff, a silent battle of wills between the defiant sailor and the unyielding matron. Elara and Anya watched, holding their breath. It felt like a turning point. If Finn could resist, if he could heal and walk out of this place on his own 2 feet, Then the spell of the haven would be broken. The fear that held them all captive might just dissipate, but the system was not designed to be broken. It was designed to absorb and neutralize. One night, the matron approached Finn, not with a tonic, but with a poultice for his leg. "To draw out the inflammation," she said, her tone softer, more reasonable. "It is a simple remedy of comfrey and mustard seed." Finn, wary but in constant pain, eventually relented. Alara watched as the matron applied the thick, dark paste to his bandages. The next morning, Finn was not better. He was delirious. He thrashed in his bed, his eyes wild with a fever that hadn't been there the day before. He no longer recognized Alara or Anya. He spoke of phantom ships and drowning men. Now, when the matron approached with her comforting draught, he could not resist. He drank it down, his body finally pliant, his spirit finally broken. He slipped into a stupor from which he never woke. 2 days later, he was dead. The matron recorded the cause as a fever of the blood brought on by his injuries. But Alara knew. She had smelled the poultice. Beneath the mustard and comfrey, there had been another scent, faint but familiar. The same bitter, metallic tongue. From the tonic vials, the system had not been broken. It had simply found a different way and dot to understand the darkness of the haven. You have to understand the world in which it existed. In 1823, the field of medicine was in the midst of a violent, hungry adolescence. Doctors and anatomists were desperate to unlock the secrets of the human body, to understand the true nature of disease. But to do that, they needed bodies. They needed cadavers to dissect. And the law, in most places, was uncooperative. Only the unclaimed bodies of executed criminals were legally available for study, and there were never enough. This shortage created a grim nocturnal industry, the trade of the resurrection men, grave robbers, men who would steal the newly dead from their resting places and sell them to medical schools under the cover of darkness. It was a grisly, illegal, yet tacitly accepted part of medical progress. Matron Hawthorne was a woman of her time. She was educated. She read medical journals, and she corresponded with some of the most respected anatomists in Boston and Philadelphia. She saw herself not as a killer, but as a pioneer, a servant to a cause greater than individual life. Why should the bodies of the poor, the weak, the forgotten, simply rot in the ground? Why should their meaningless deaths not serve a higher purpose? The haven of perpetual solace was her answer. It was a solution to two problems at once. It relieved the town of its human refuse, and it provided a steady, reliable source of anatomical material, untainted by the messiness of decomposition or the risk of grave robbing. She was not a resurrectionist. She was a procurement specialist. Her institution wasn't just a hospice, it was a factory, and its product was the dead. The cruelty wasn't a byproduct of her system. It was the engine that made it run, all hidden beneath a veneer of unimpeachable piety and scientific advancement. The letters were kept in a locked drawer in her office. Alara knew because she had been tasked with dusting in there once, under the matron's watchful eye. She had seen the elegant script on the envelopes, the seals from a prestigious Boston medical college. The matron called it Consulting on Matters of Public Health. Alara now understood it was a transaction, a bill of lading for human souls. The matron wasn't just ending lives. She was harvesting them. This realization shifted something fundamental. In Alara, the fear became heavier, colder. This wasn't the work of a single, cruel woman. It was part of a larger machine, a machine of men in fine coats who spoke of progress and enlightenment while holding scalpels over the bodies of people like Finn. The matron was just a cog in that machine, a vital one who sanitized the dirty work and gave it the gloss of charity. The institution itself was the true monster. Its walls were built of public approval. Its foundation was laid with the silent consent of a society that wanted its problems to simply disappear. The haven offered a simple, terrible bargain. Give us your unwanted, and we will make them invisible. No one asked what happened after the doors closed. No one wanted to know. The quiet, orderly deaths were a relief not just for the dying, but for the living. The town could sleep soundly, knowing the poor were being cared for, the sick were being comforted, and the moral ledger was balanced. The horror was not that Matron Hawthorne was evil. The horror was that, in the eyes of her world, she was doing good. She had turned the act of eradication into an act of civic virtue. And Ilara was trapped inside, a witness to a truth that no one, absolutely no one, wanted to hear. Finn's death shattered Anya. The spark of defiance in her eyes guttered and went out, replaced by a dull, hollow fear. She stopped talking in the laundry, stopped meeting Ilara's gaze. She moved through her chores like a ghost, her shoulders perpetually slumped in defeat. She had seen what happened to resistance. She had seen hope poisoned and buried. A few weeks later, a cough settled deep in her chest. At first, it was just a nuisance, a dry hack that she tried to stifle in her sleeve. But in the damp, cold air of the haven, it festered. The cough became wet and ragged. A fever bloomed on her cheeks. She was genuinely ill. And in the haven of perpetual solace, genuine illness was a death sentence. Ilara's own fear was eclipsed by a fierce, desperate protectiveness. She refused to let Anya become another quiet entry in the matron's logbook. She took on Anya's chores, letting her rest. She snuck her extra broth from the kitchen, ignoring the matron's watery gruel. She insisted on giving her only cool water, pushing away the inevitable comforting draught. For a few days, it seemed to work. Anya's fever waned. A little color returned to her cheeks. Ilara felt a sliver of her own hope returning. She could fight the system. She could save one person. It was a small, secret rebellion, a lit candle in the overwhelming dark. But the matron's eyes missed nothing. She observed Ilara's frantic efforts with a look of cold pity. She saw not an act of love, but an act of foolish, childish defiance. The confrontation came on a gray, drizzling afternoon. Ilara was sitting by Anya's bedside, wiping her brow with a damp cloth. Anya was sleeping, her breath still shallow but even. The door opened and Matron Hawthorne stood there, holding the familiar dark bottle and a cup. "She is weak," the matron said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "She needs this to regain her strength." Ilara rose to her feet, placing herself between the matron and Anya's bed. "No," she said, her own voice a tremor. "She is getting better. She just needs rest." The matron's eyes narrowed. For the first time, Ilara saw not just coldness, but a flash of pure, unadulterated anger. "Your sentiment is a sin, child," she hissed. "You are prolonging her suffering out of selfishness. You are interfering with God's will." "It's not God's will," Ilara whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It's yours." The words hung in the air, a blasphemy. The matron moved with a speed that was shocking in a woman of her age and bearing. She shoved Ilara aside hard. Ilara stumbled, catching herself on the foot of the bed. The matron loomed over Anya, forcing the cup to her lips, pouring the dark liquid into her mouth as the sick girl sputtered and coughed. "Drink," the matron commanded, her voice a steel whip. "Find your peace." Ilara could only watch in horror, paralyzed. It was a violation, a desecration. Anya's eyes fluttered open for a moment and met Ilara's. In them, Ilara saw not peace, but a look of profound and final betrayal. Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp. The matron set the empty cup on the bedside table. She straightened her dress and looked at Ilara, her face a mask of pious resolution. "The Lord has called her home," she said, but all Ilara could hear was the sound of her own heart breaking. The last candle of her hope had been extinguished. Grief is a strange and powerful fuel. The sorrow Ilara felt for Anya was a cold, hard stone in her chest, but it was not heavy enough to crush her. It sharpened her. It burned away the last of her fear, leaving behind a diamond-hard resolve. She would not let Anya's death be just another quiet erasure. She had to know. She had to know the full scope of the evil that permeated this house. Her grief gave her a new kind of courage, the courage of someone with nothing left to lose. She began to move through the haven, not as an apprentice, but as a spy. Her eyes, once downcast, were now sharp, observant. She was looking for proof, for something tangible that she could hold up to the light, something that could not be explained away by piety or medicine. Her search led her to the cold cellar. It was a damp, subterranean room, carved out of the cliff's rock face, used for storing root vegetables, salted meats, and for a short time, the bodies of the dead before they were placed in their coffins. The air in the cellar was always frigid, and it carried a strange, earthy smell mixed with the ever-present chemical tang of the haven. Ilara had always hated this room. It felt ancient, primal. It felt like a place of secrets. She remembered Anya once saying she heard strange scratching sounds coming from the walls down here. At the time, they had dismissed it as rats. Now, Ilara wasn't so sure. She went down with a single flickering candle, the shadows dancing around her like grasping specters. She ran her hands along the cold, weeping stone of the far wall, the one that backed directly into the earth of the cliff. She was looking for anything, a loose stone, a crack. A draft got her fingers, numb with cold, brushed against it. A single block of stone that seemed to shift, just slightly, under her touch. Her heart leaped into her throat. Using the tips of her fingers, she pried at the edges. It was heavy, sealed with dried mortar, but years of dampness had weakened it. With a final desperate heave, she pulled it free. It came away with a grating scrape and a shower of dust, revealing a cavity behind it, a dark, gaping maw in the wall. The smell that wafted out was overwhelming. It was the smell of decay, of damp earth, and of something else, something horribly, sickeningly familiar. It was the smell of death, but not the clean, sanitized death of the infirmary. This was the smell of secrets. Of rot, with her hand trembling so violently she could barely hold the candle steady, Ilara peered into the darkness. At first, she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. It looked like a pile of bundled rags. But as her eyes adjusted, the shape resolved itself. It was a small bundle, wrapped in what looked like a tattered baby's blanket, and sticking out from one end were the tiny, perfect skeletal fingers of a human infant. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her so intensely she had to brace herself against the wall. This was the fate of the unwed mothers who sought refuge at the haven. This was the mercy they were given. Her gaze traveled further into the cavity. It wasn't just one bundle. The space was filled with them. Dozens of small, cloth-wrapped parcels, stacked one on top of the other. And behind them, larger shapes wrapped in burlap. Her mind reeled. This wasn't a cellar. It was a catacomb. The haven wasn't built on a foundation of stone. It was built on a foundation of bone dot. She didn't know how many there were. She didn't want to know. The sight had burned itself onto the back of her eyelids. She stumbled back from the wall, her mind a maelstrom of horror. She had found her proof. But what was she supposed to do with it? Who would believe her? An orphan, an apprentice, accusing the sainted matron Hawthorne of this? They would call her mad. They would lock her away. Or worse. She felt a presence behind her and spun around, a scream catching in her throat. Matron Hawthorne stood at the top of the cellar stairs, holding a lantern. The light cast her face. In demonic shadows, she wasn't angry. She wasn't shocked. Her expression was one of calm, weary disappointment, as if she had caught a child stealing a cookie. "I knew you had a curious spirit, Alara," the matron said, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. "It is a flaw I had hoped to temper." She descended the stairs slowly, her gaze fixed on the open hole in the wall. She did not flinch from it. She looked at the exposed bundles with a kind of dispassionate ownership. "You see only the vessel," she said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. "You do not see the soul that has been released from its flawed container. You do not understand the necessity of the work." She stepped closer to Alara, the lantern light illuminating the girl's terrified face. "I am not a monster," she said, as if trying to reason with a child. "I am a gardener. I simply pull the weeds so the stronger plants may flourish. I bring order to the chaos of nature. It is a sacred duty." The calm, rational tone of her voice was more terrifying than any shout. This wasn't madness as Ilara understood it. It was a complete and utter inversion of morality, a philosophy of death so absolute it saw itself as a form of divine creation. In that frozen moment, in the cold, fetid air of the tomb she had uncovered, Alara understood the true nature of her choice. It was not between life and death. It was between two kinds of oblivion. She could scream, fight, and be silenced. Her body would be bundled into the wall with the others, her existence erased, her story untold. Or she could submit. She could accept the matron's twisted philosophy, become another cog in the machine, and survive. The matron saw the calculation in her eyes. "You are not like the others, Alara," she said, her voice softening, becoming almost seductive. "You are intelligent. You have strength. You see the world as it is. There is a place for you here, not as an apprentice. As a partner, help me with my work. Find purpose. Find security. The world outside has nothing for you but pain and poverty. Here, you can be part of something important." She was offering Alara a key to a cage, but a cage where she would be fed and protected. A cage where she would be on the side of the one holding the poison, not the one forced to drink it. It was the ultimate temptation, to trade her soul for safety, to become the monster to avoid being its victim. Alara looked from the matron's serene, expectant face to the dark hole in the wall, the silent testament to her work. She thought of Eleanor. She thought of Finn. And she thought of Anya's eyes in that final moment of betrayal. Her terror began to recede, replaced by a cold, silent rage. A rage so pure and so absolute it felt like clarity. She knew what she had to do. She looked back at the matron, and lowering her eyes in a gesture of submission she did not feel, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The matron smiled. It was the first genuine smile Ilara had ever seen from her. It was the most horrifying thing she had ever witnessed. For the next 2 days, Ilara played the part of the convert. She was quiet, obedient, and efficient. She didn't meet anyone's eyes. She did her chores with a new, chilling focus. The matron, believing she had broken the girl's spirit and remade it in her own image, began to instruct her. She showed Ilara how to mix the comforting draughts, explaining the precise measurements needed for a peaceful release versus a simple sedative. She spoke of the anatomy, of the beauty of the human machine, and of the necessity of acquiring specimens for study. She was grooming her successor. Ilara listened, she nodded, and she learned. She learned which oils for the lamps were the most flammable. She learned where the lye was stored, the same lye used to scrub the floors, and, she now suspected, to hasten the decomposition of the bodies in the walls. She learned the layout of the house, the drafts, the weak points in the old wood. She was not planning an escape. An escape would leave the tomb intact, the secret sealed, the matron free to continue her work. She was planning a cleansing. On the third night, a storm rolled in from the sea, battering the coast with wind and rain. It was the perfect cover. The haven was battened down against the gale, its residents sleeping soundly, many with the help of the matron's nightly rounds. Alara waited until the deepest point of the night, when the only sounds were the howling wind and the groaning of the old house. She moved silently, a shadow in the halls she now knew so well. This was not an act of justice. Justice was for a world that made sense, a world where the good were rewarded and the evil were punished. This was something far more primal. It was an act of negation, a desperate attempt to burn away a thing so fundamentally wrong that it could not be allowed to exist. She was not a hero. She was not a savior. She was simply the last witness, and she would make sure that what she had seen would never be seen. Again, that she started in the cellar. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she pulled more stones from the wall, exposing the hidden sepulchre to the air. She poured the lye and the lamp oil over the bundled remains, her movements quick and methodical. She worked her way up through the house, splashing oil on the draperies in the matron's office, on the stacks of linens in the laundry, on the wooden floorboards outside the infirmary. Her heart was a cold, steady drum. There was no fear, no hesitation. She was an instrument of the fire she was about to unleash. Her last stop was the matron's own room. She stood over the sleeping woman for a moment, the woman who had saved her and damned her in the same breath. She felt nothing, no pity, no hatred, just a vast, empty space where her childhood had once been. She left a single trail of oil from the matron's doorway down the main staircase. She lit the first flame in the cellar, tossing a lit candle into the oil-soaked tomb. The fire caught with a hungry whoosh. Then she moved to the main floor, lighting the trails she had laid. The old, dry wood of the house went up in an instant. Flames clawed their way up the walls, consuming everything in their path. The fire was alive. It roared with a voice of its own, a voice of cleansing fury. Alara didn't wait to see the result. She slipped out a back door into the raging storm, the heat of the inferno at her back. She didn't look back. She scrambled up the muddy slope of the cliff behind the haven, the wind tearing at her thin dress, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, finally collapsing in the wet grass at the top of the bluff, where she could look down on the place that had been her home and her prison. From the darkness of the clifftop, Alara watched her old life burn. The haven of perpetual solace was a raging pyre against the black, storm-tossed sky. Flames erupted from the windows like screaming mouths, reaching for the clouds. The roof groaned and then collapsed inward with a shower of sparks that momentarily outshone the lightning. Down below, figures began to gather on the road townspeople, drawn from their beds by the light and the sound. Their faces, illuminated by the inferno, were masks of shock and horror. They saw a tragedy. They saw the sainted matron Hawthorne, their beacon of charity, perishing in the flames with her helpless charges. They saw the end of a noble institution. They would mourn. They would erect a monument. They would tell stories of the matrons. Sacrifice. Alara watched them, and for the first time, she cried. Not for the matron, not for the life she had lost, but for the story that would be told. The fire was not a cleansing. It was just an ending. The truth would be buried under the ashes, just as the bodies had been buried in the walls. The system hadn't been defeated. It had just been given a more heroic narrative. She, the only one who knew the truth, was now a ghost, a non-person. If she were found, she would be the arsonist, a mad girl who had murdered her savior. Her act of resistance was invisible. Her scream was silent. She was alone, shivering in the storm, with nothing but the terrible, burning knowledge of what she had done and why. Was this survival? Or was it just a different kind of tomb, a life spent in the shadows, haunted by the quiet faces of the dead? The fire raged on, but the cold in her soul was a cold that no flame could ever touch. The ashes of the haven settled over Port Blossom, but the questions it raised never did. If these hidden histories, these stories of silent resistance against unspeakable wrongs, are a vital part of understanding who we are, help us continue to unearth them. Your support allows us to keep telling the stories that must not be forgotten. In the official town records of Port Blossom, the fire of 1823 is noted as a terrible accident. Matron Althea Hawthorne is memorialized as a martyr who died trying to save the indigent souls in her care. When investigators sifted through the charred ruins, they found the remains of 23 unidentified individuals in the collapsed cellar walls. This discovery was not seen as evidence of a crime, but as a testament to the matron's boundless charity. The conclusion was that, lacking the funds for proper burials, she had given these poor souls a final, humble resting place within the very walls of the home that had sheltered them. She was canonized in the memory of the town, her legend a warning against the dangers of fire, not the horrors of piety. No one ever looked for a 17-year-old orphan girl named Ilara. Her name was not on any official roster. In the chaos, she was simply forgotten, presumed to be one of the many unnamed victims consumed by the flames. Her existence was erased from history, and so the system, in the end, rewrote its own story. It smoothed over the cracks, hid the rot, and turned a house of horrors into a shrine of heroic sacrifice. The true horror was not the 23 bodies in the walls, but the ease with which the truth could be buried, earned, and rebuilt into a more comfortable lie. Ilara, wherever she went, carried the real story with her. A story with no proof, no witnesses, and no ending. A ghost story whispered only to herself. A constant reminder that the most monstrous things in this world are not done by monsters, but by people who believe with all their hearts that they are doing good.